Welcome back to Yoga Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Waycott. As always, it is wonderful to be in the recording studio, and I hope that you're doing well if you're tuning in today. I just wrapped up a level 2 Reiki training. I think I mentioned this, I don't know, probably a couple of months ago that I had taken a level 1 Reiki training, and today was level 2. So I just spent the past 8 hours in meditation, learning, practicing Reiki, receiving Reiki, and it was really beautiful. And I feel really motivated to start practicing Reiki on the people close to me. And I would love to one day integrate some Reiki healing into my yoga offerings. I think that would be really beautiful and really healing. So I feel excited. I feel lit up about the training that I just took. And I feel like that always happens to me. Every time I take any kind of yoga teacher training or continuing education, I'm always super excited afterwards. Maybe you feel like that too. So it was a really good day, but it has been a week over here. And I feel like I said that a few weeks ago when I had a full-on tech breakdown, and I mentioned that my phone and my laptop all broke on the same day, and it was frustrating because as a modern yoga teacher, you need technology in order to get by. But this past week was a full-on body breakdown, a physical body breakdown, because I ended up getting super sick. And my husband, Kyler, had a cold, and I was so determined not to catch it. I was like, I'm not going to get this. It's just going to skip me. But alas, the sickness got me. And that's what happens when you live in the same house as other humans. And it was so bad that I actually had to cancel 2 of my yoga classes, which for me feels like a big deal because I never, ever cancel. I cancel class maybe once a year tops. And it's usually because there's a snowstorm or an ice storm or, some kind of Mother Nature related event that we have no control over. And being sick and getting a virus is also a Mother Nature related event. But I was so unwell, I couldn't even bring a key to a substitute teacher. So I had to email everyone and be like, I'm so sorry, class is canceled. Obviously, everyone was very understanding. But it was actually hilarious. I was so unwell, I'm pretty sure the FBI agent that lives in my phone could hear the way that I was coughing. And I started getting Temu ads for tombstones. And even my phone was she's on her way out. Anyways, I'm being a little bit dramatic. But today we're doing something a little bit different because in the midst of my sickness this past week, I basically had a full-on crash out. And my crash out was a small existential crisis induced by the current state of the yoga and wellness industry. It was definitely also induced by being sick and having some extra time with my thoughts. But I feel like it was needed because there was, a revelation that came from it. There was some clarity that came from it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm glad you're here. So here's what actually happened. I was sick for over a week, and I know that the past few months have been quite busy for me on a personal level, and a professional level. And I do have a history of crashing out a little bit, or maybe even burning out a little bit after periods of intense output. And if you're interested in human design, like I'm a manifestor type in human design. We're a pretty small percentage of the population. But basically we get like these big bursts of creative energy where we're like, go, 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 and we need to do a bunch of things. And then we basically shut down and need to hibernate for an extended period of time afterwards. And I have learned that's the way that my energy works. And I used to get like this in university a lot, where I would push through for a whole semester and I would get through exam season. And then as soon as, like, literally the day that I would write my final exam of the semester, I would just completely crash and end up getting like a really bad cold or really bad flu and just being like forced to lie down on the couch. So this is part of like the way that I work. And I know that about myself. But somebody that I really admire reminded me that I've actually been go, go, go for like the past 3 years, and that I've been going through a significant amount of professional growth over the past few years, to the point where sometimes it feels like I'm almost like a brand new yoga teacher again. And I think that it started for me about 3 years ago around this time, when I was finishing up writing the curriculum for what is now my 200-hour yoga teacher training program. And when I wrote that curriculum, it was before ChatGPT existed. So I just want to make that clear that I literally birthed that program out of my own brain. And it was really intense writing the program. It reminded me of like writing a thesis. And that period of intensity led to quite quickly running multiple 200-hour yoga teacher trainings in a pretty small span of time, which was a huge like growth and learning opportunity for me as a teacher. And then alongside that, I was also creating new in-person CE programs, running those CE programs. I was running independent yoga classes 12 months of the year. I went completely independent as a yoga teacher and stepped away from regular studio teaching. And even to like just, you know, the efforts that I've been making to put myself out there, both as a brand and in terms of public relations efforts. Like there's been a lot of really uncomfortable growth in the past few years, right? And like if you want to grow, you do have to get uncomfortable. You know, when I reflect on all of it, like I've been traveling for yoga teacher trainings, and I ran a retreat, and then I started this podcast. And then like, you know, things in my personal life and like getting engaged and getting married. And like, it's actually been a hugely transformational time these past few years, both personally and professionally. And I knew that, but I think this past week really forced me to like stop and realize how far I've come. And part of that process was also like having a little bit of a crash out. And I think that it started over something really small, which is kind of funny, but I'm just going to tell you anyways, because, you know, if you're here listening, you might find it funny too. But it started when every time I tried to show up online, I would lose like 10 followers on Instagram. And I know that that sounds really silly and really petty, but I'm only human, and my social media has not been growing lately. And if you're in the same boat, then maybe this will be a nice reminder for you that like the trajectory of our social media growth is not always upwards. And my follower count has been shrinking. And I'm pretty sure that starting a podcast is what triggered that. And when I first not when I first had the idea to start the podcast, but like when the podcast became real, I remember thinking that to myself and almost having this little pep talk to myself, like, okay, the fact that you have a podcast is going to repel some people. And especially the fact that, like, this is a very niche podcast, right? It is made specifically for yoga teachers, and mostly for yoga teachers who are like more on the independent side and who are doing things on their own. And that's a very, very small niche group of people. And so it's realistic for me to have to understand that, like, there's a lot of people out there who are simply not going to be interested in a podcast for yoga teachers. And maybe, you know, they used to follow my social media account for something else, and now when I'm posting, you know, clips from my podcast, they're like, what the heck is this? But it feels like every single time on Instagram, like, regardless of what I post, and I really don't think that I post anything polarizing, my follower account just gets like lower and lower and lower. And I'm like, why is this happening? And you kind of start to spiral. And yeah, you know, the reality is, like, my yoga classes and yoga offerings are busy, they're well attended. So losing followers on social media shouldn't really matter. But it wasn't just that. It was like a bunch of little things stacking up. And I feel like that's kind of what triggered my small downward spiral. And in my sickness and my week of being ill, I definitely had extra time to ruminate and to be with my thoughts. And I couldn't help but start thinking about the yoga and wellness industry as a whole. And, you know, I was thinking about, like, all of these trauma healing workshops that I'm seeing that are taught by people who don't have credentials in healing trauma. Like, they're not clinicians. I was thinking about the kind of like performative spirituality out there from people who like to pretend that they have their shit together. And at least on this podcast, I don't have to pretend that I have it together, because I definitely don't have it together all the time. But, like, this is the reality of working in a completely unregulated and unlicensed industry. And as many of you know, it's truly the Wild West out there. People can call themselves all sorts of things and run all sorts of strange workshops and programs. And sometimes I just get genuinely upset that there are people in my industry who exploit and leverage people's vulnerabilities and traumas in order to make money. Like, sometimes that just gets to me and upsets me. And I think something in me just kind of snapped this last week. And the question that I kept asking myself was, where do I fit in? Like, where do I fit within this industry that I've watched change so much over the last 14 years that I've worked in it? And what I realized was, like, oh, I don't exactly fit in to the current wellness culture, and I actually don't want to either. And that was like, boom, my moment of clarity this week. And so what I'm realizing right now is that there's a bit of a tension between who I am as a yoga teacher and what's happening in the wellness industry, right? The yoga industrial complex, which we can't deny the existence of. Because like, I know that people like to say, well, yoga is not an industry, it's a practice. Like, of course it's a practice, but there is an industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry that exists, and we have to acknowledge its existence. Like, we're part of it. And I think if you're listening to this podcast, I have a feeling you might also feel from time to time that type of tension, right? Between like what you believe in as a yoga teacher and then what's going on in the broader like wellness world and yoga industry, and how do we, work with both of them. And so the clarity that I have from my little crash out this week is that when I feel like I don't fit in, it's a good thing. And I want you to remind yourself of that as well. Like, I don't necessarily want to be part of all of the wellness culture that I see out there. And I keep coming back to something that I read by Alex Otter so many years ago. This was like before COVID. And if you don't know who she is, she's like an actress and a producer and a yoga teacher and a writer. I don't know exactly like what she wants to be called, but she makes a lot of comedic, like social commentary about the state of the wellness industry and yoga teachers, right? Like, she makes fun of us. And I don't want to take this too far out of context, but she said something about modern wellness being like palliative care for the end of civilization. And like, I get it. Like, I get it now. I'm like, oh yeah, like we're in a really weird place. And I think that people often turn to practices like yoga and alternative wellness when they're feeling their most vulnerable. And that's not always the case, but for a lot of folks, that's the entry point. And I just think we have to be like so careful as yoga teachers with some of the people that are coming into classes, like looking for healing or looking for transformation. And I feel a little bit of sadness right now for some of the students that fall prey to some of that really predatory marketing that's out there, especially promises about like healing trauma. Okay. I feel, disappointed about, the fact that there is a lot of predatory marketing going on. And I also feel disappointed that we're in an industry where there's very little accountability, right? Like, all we can do, and the thing that we have control over, is like holding ourselves accountable. But when somebody within the industry does something genuinely harmful or illegal from time to time, it takes a really massive community effort in order to speak up. And it often gets really messy. And what I've noticed is usually that person that people are speaking up about still finds a way to keep teaching. Like, just think of Bikram. And right now we're seeing this in the Ashtanga yoga community. And it's interesting because people will have really devout followers simply because of their charisma and simply because of their ability to lie and manipulate and tell people what they want to hear. And with all of that being said, I think that there can sometimes be like a little bit of a loneliness that comes with having high ethical standards for yourself. There's a loneliness sometimes in like being that teacher who's like, I'm not going to promise or say anything about the fact that, there might be healing that's taking place in my classes. Like, if that happens for you, that's great. But my scope of practice is super, super limited, and I have to stay within it in order to keep everybody safe. And Yoga Alliance, despite all of its issues and shortcomings, they do have a clear like ethical commitment and scope of practice, and it's not the most comprehensive, but it is a good starting point. And you know, it's what I use as my reference as like a regular yoga teacher. I'm not a yoga therapist, but you know, I think the issue is that with Yoga Alliance, like there's no accountability and there's nobody checking in to see if teachers are actually following these standards. Like we're left to hold ourselves accountable. And that gets really, really tricky. And like I said, it's kind of the Wild West out there, and people can basically do whatever they want and call themselves whatever they want. And I think that, you know, sometimes teachers end up like overstepping that scope of practice in the name of being impressive or wanting to stand out, or maybe they just want to like sell more services. But what ends up happening is people show up to their classes and they're showing up with like their biggest wounds, and they're showing up with all of their pain and their mental health struggles and their grief. And then the yoga teacher, and I'm just talking about regular yoga teachers, not yoga therapists, but the yoga teacher who's not a clinician is then left almost like drowning in this huge responsibility that they're not trained to hold. And I think that the potential for harm in these kinds of situations is really massive. And yeah, like such a funny thing. It's not funny, but it's like, it's an interesting thing to be having a crash out about as a regular yoga teacher. And I think part of it is like, I've seen some of that harm take place in front of me in, you know, real yoga communities that I've been part of. I've seen it firsthand where really charismatic, likable teachers get put on pedestals and they're idolized by people. They have lots of followers. They're seen as like mentors or spiritual guides or spiritual leaders. And then when that teacher inevitably falls from grace, because it always happens. So like when the truth comes out about them, then the people who are following them are so genuinely devastated. And I've literally seen this happen firsthand. And like, then all of their students and all of their followers don't know who to turn to. They feel betrayed. They feel embarrassed for, you know, believing this person's message in the first place. They lose faith in the practice of yoga. They don't even want to practice yoga anymore. And it's like a really, really hard, sad thing to see. And it has been happening for a long time. And I think it's going to continue to happen. And, you know, part of the clarity or the learning, I guess, that I want to share from my little crash out is like, I'm always telling other yoga teachers and like yoga teachers in training to pay attention to what lights you up, right? And pay attention to like what makes you really excited, what gets you stoked, because like that's going to give you so much information about like the direction to go as a yoga teacher and like what to teach on and what to pursue further studies on. And I also think that we should pay close attention to the things that piss us off and the things that make us sad and frustrated and disappointed, because those things can also be really, really illuminating. And I think that when there are situations like this where we're like, wow, I feel, you know, kind of defeated or like disappointed in the whole industry, like that, first of all, shows that you really, really care, right? Like if you're feeling that way, you obviously care a lot about the industry, you know, the next generation of yoga teachers. And that information about what you care deeply about can really act as a guide for how you operate as a yoga teacher and for how you want to be, right? So maybe it means that you really, really follow a scope of practice closely and you're really careful about like what you're putting out there and what you're offering. And like, I think that's been my lesson this last week. Because part of me, like this little voice in my head was saying like, you need to stop ruminating on these things. And obviously like our attachments and like, going around and around in our mind is a source of our suffering. And like, we don't want to just keep going around in circles. But there's this little voice in my head that's like, Alex, mind your own business, like focus on your own stuff, eyes on your own paper, that kind of thing. Let other people do what they're going to do and just focus on yourself. And it would be easy to tell myself that, but I think that, there's also something there that's like, hey, if you're upset about some of the things that you're seeing, like that's an indicator that you really care and that maybe you're going to do things differently. And so if you're a yoga teacher, I urge you to pay attention not just to what lights you up, but to what makes you annoyed. Because I think that like there's so much goodness there, and that there's probably some inquiry there that's like worth investigating and worth getting curious about. So that's what I'm sitting with right now and this week, and I'm thankful to report that I think I'm on the other side of my crash out. Like, I know that my voice doesn't sound great, but I'm definitely starting to improve and, feel better from my little cold that I've been battling. And that's what I'm meditating on right now is like, what can I learn from these things that are bothering me and annoying me? And what do I have control of in my own life and my own teachings and my own actions moving forward to do things in a way that feels good to me and to work and operate in a way that is in integrity with my values and with what I believe in. So I'm still meditating on that this week, and maybe this is an invitation for you to do the same. So I'm going to leave you with that today. Thanks for indulging me with this chatty little episode. And I want to thank you so much for being here, so much for tuning in. Make sure that if you've been listening to the podcast, that you are rating the podcast wherever you're listening so that more yoga teachers around the world can join in on our weekly conversations. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next time.